If you're looking to buy your first Sony camera and you are on a strict budget, it's okay. You've actually still got options. So this video is made for beginners who really don't have a great understanding of what their choices are for buying a dedicated camera this year. I think media, a lot of us shoot on Sony camera systems and there are a ton of options to choose from, but today we are breaking it down really simply and looking at 9 cameras as cheap as around like $100 all the way up to like $1,800 to find the right fit for you depending on your budget.
You gotta just press record.
So a little over a year ago, I was on the hunt for the cheapest Sony camera that I could possibly find. And I came across this camera right here that I'm recording on for $69 on eBay. And when I first saw the listing, I was super skeptical, but I just decided, hey, why not? Let's give it a try. Let's see what this thing can do. This is a Sony NEX-3N and was released back in 2013. This was a part of the wave of Sony NEX cameras that a lot of people didn't really know about. And the people that did know about them sort of thought they were a joke. Back then, mirrorless cameras weren't really taken all that seriously. So these cameras kind of flew under the radar. But now fast forward to 2024, cameras like this one right here can be found for around $160, but that also includes a lens. Typically, it ships with the 16 to 50 millimeter kit lens that was released with this camera. So that lens typically costs around $80. So you're getting that lens for about $80, and then the camera would be whatever the remainder price would be. So if it was $160, it'd be around $80 for the camera and $80 for the lens, which is a pretty mind-blowing deal. Now, in terms of photo quality with this camera, honestly, it's pretty awesome. You get a high-quality 16 megapixel sensor that actually performs pretty well. You can shoot in the RAW file format and get really high-quality RAW images, as well as shoot in RAW plus JPEG or just JPEG if you didn't really want to edit your images in something like Lightroom. So if you'd like to learn the basics of photography, this is a really good camera to do so. You can learn the exposure triangle, which is how to set your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture to manually control the exposure of your image. And this is a great camera to start practicing and learning those principles. Now, in terms of video quality, you can see the image right now. I'd say that the video quality is passable. It certainly is not the best looking image I've ever seen as far as video is concerned. You can check out some of this B-roll on the screen just to get a better sense of what the video performance of this camera is like. This camera maxes out at 1080p resolution at 24 frames per second or 60i, which is the interlace format, which isn't really relevant in 2024. I wouldn't shoot in the 60i format. I just shoot in the 24p option. You also are limited to the AVC HD video codec, which is a much older codec that a lot of these Sony cameras used to shoot in, and then they updated codecs over the years. So AVC HD, it's fine. It's definitely not the best. And frankly, it's a little bit difficult to get the highest quality image if you are shooting in the AVC HD format. One of the good things about the video mode in this camera is you are able to adjust all of your camera settings when you're shooting video. Some of the NEX cameras actually can't do this, but the Sony NEX-3N, even though it's one of the more baseline entry-level models for the NEX series, it does allow you to manually adjust all your camera settings like shutter speed and aperture and ISO. This camera actually also supports autofocus tracking in video mode, which is kind of wild for an 11-year-old camera. I can move left to right, forward and back, and it's actually going to track me pretty well. It is a little bit slow, but it does perform the focusing operation really smoothly, and it's not as jittery as I would honestly expect for a camera this old, which is pretty impressive. And you also get a flip-up screen, which is what I'm using right now to view my image. I don't have to connect this camera to an external monitor like some other cameras that don't have a flip-up screen. Because of the flip-up screen, I'm able to just view myself, and that saves me some money not having to run an HDMI cable into a second monitor in order to be able to view myself while recording. So for $160, you could get this camera with a kit lens and be ready to shoot some content. But is that setup better than just using your phone? I think the answer kind of depends on what you're doing. If you are just taking photos and you want to learn how to take high quality stills images, I think a camera like this is a much better option than a cell phone due to the large APS-C style sensor and the ability to swap interchangeable lenses for different creative looks. That's really going to increase your photo quality, being able to adapt different kinds of lenses. But when it comes to video specs, this camera just doesn't have the greatest video options as far as resolutions and frame rates and codecs are concerned. So this camera doesn't shoot in 4K. I actually had to scale up the 1080p file from this camera 200% in order to fill this 4K frame for the export of this video. So I'm actually pretty surprised at how well well the scaling of this image held up in post-production. So I think if you needed to use this for video in a pinch, you could, but I would probably just use my phone. I've linked this guide down below in the description so you can check it out, as well as all of the other cameras on our list as well. Now, if you have just a little bit more to spend, but you still want to look at some used options, you can't go wrong with the Sony a6000. This is one of the best-selling Sony cameras of all time, and at the time of its release back in 2014, it had one of the best autofocus systems of basically any camera on the market, and its autofocus even holds up super well today. Price-wise, these a6000s are going all day long for around $350 on used markets. I've seen them for as low as $250 to $275 on specifically Facebook Marketplace, so just keep your eyes peeled for a really good deal. When we look at the video quality of the a6000, we see a significant improvement over the whole NEX series that this camera was replacing at the time. So we still are limited though to 1080p video, but we do get up to 60 frames per second shooting, which gives you the ability to shoot at that higher frame rate and then slow down your footage in post-production, which is really nice for getting slow motion and cinematic B-roll if that's something you're interested in. One of the main reasons that the image quality for video looks so much better over the NEX3N is its brand new video codec XAVC-S, and all this really means is it's a more efficient way of compressing and decompressing a video file to retain better image quality as an end result. The a6000 also gave us a brand new design with more button options and more control dials on the body, which just makes for a better user experience if you like to control more aspects of your camera. Now, unlike the NEX3N, the a6000 allows us to have a clean HDMI feed, which is honestly one of the strongest selling points for picking up this camera even 10 years later after it was released. This means that you can send the a6000's video signal to computer devices by connecting it to an HDMI capture card, and now you can use this camera as a webcam and use it for live streaming or video calls. The 1080p resolution in this camera has actually never overheated for me in indoor environments, and I've actually been able to get over 5 hours of on time with this camera by connecting a dummy battery to the camera, which we'll link down in the description below. So if you're looking for a high quality webcam this year, the a6000 actually might be a really good option. Now, when it comes to photo performance with the a6000, honestly, this is a really good camera. I have such a fun time shooting with this camera because it sort of feels like an older piece of technology, but the final results are honestly on par with some of the latest cameras that Sony has released. So you aren't really sacrificing photo image quality at all, but you are getting this camera for a really affordable price. So overall, this is one of the best starter cameras for learning the basics of photography and videography, and it could even integrate really well into a 1080p workflow for live streaming or using it as a webcam. Okay, but maybe you're somebody who doesn't want to deal with buying a used camera and doing the research and trying to make sure that the product you're buying is actually functional. I get that. It takes a lot of time and stress. So if you want to buy a new camera in 2024, the cheapest Sony camera you can purchase right now is the Sony ZV-1F. This camera costs $498 new, which is a pretty reasonable price for a starter camera that has a built-in lens. With most of the cameras on our list, they leverage the Sony E-mount system, which means you can attach and detach different lenses to the cameras, which will increase your cost to start making content because you have to buy a lens. While with several of the ZV-1 series cameras, like the ZV-1F, they come with built-in lenses, so it saves you money to not have to purchase other lenses after you buy your camera body. The built-in lens with the ZV-1F is a 20mm lens that shoots at a maximum aperture value of f2.0. So that actually lets in quite a bit of light for shooting in lower light situations. The 20mm focal length is a great focal length for vlogging or even using it as a webcam at your workstation. This camera has a 1-inch sensor, which is fairly large in terms of a pocket-sized camera, but it's not as big as most of the cameras on our list, which are APS-C size, which is a little bit larger, but a 1-inch sensor is going to be quite a bit bigger than most of the sensors in cell phone cameras today. So in terms of video specs, you get 4K up to 30 frames per second, and the 4K footage actually looks pretty good in this camera. The autofocus of the ZV-1F in particular is contrast-based autofocus, so that's a little bit of an older technology that they put in this camera to save money. The autofocus still works pretty well and tracks you. It's just a little bit slower than the phase detect autofocus systems that are in the newer Sony cameras. But the one problem that I just cannot figure out with this camera is why we get all of these little micro jitters. Like maybe you can see it right over here with the light that's behind me or this light up here. These little micro jitters are happening because I believe the camera is continuously trying to acquire focus and it's focus breathing while it's trying to continuously focus. And I cannot get rid of this when I'm in autofocus, which is super obnoxious. Right now, I'm actually going to just kind of get myself into a good position to where I know the camera is going to focus on an even plane right here. Then I'm going to reach way up here and then turn my camera to manual focus. So now the camera's in manual focus. It's just locked off a focus area right here around my face. And now I think those jitters are gone. If my testing is correct, all of those jitters only happen when the camera is in continuous focus. Now I just switched to manual and I think the jitters are gone. I mean, you tell me, are the jitters gone? I don't know. So in my opinion, if you're spending $500 on a camera like this, it needs to be able to focus smoothly and not have these weird jitters going on. And I think it is still a pretty good walk around camera for videographers or even streamers if you're streaming at a workstation, kind of like my setup right here. But if you're somebody who doesn't want to deal with those weird micro jitters, I don't blame you at all. I'm actually going to keep this camera in manual focus so that doesn't happen the rest of the time I'm using it here. And if that's a deal breaker for you, there's some other point and shoots that might be a better option. Also on the photo side for this camera cannot shoot RAW files. So this is not a photographer's camera at all. You're only able to shoot in the JPEG format. So you're not going to really be able to maximize the photo capabilities that most cameras have with the RAW file type. If I was buying a camera for photography and it didn't have RAW files, it automatically would not be on my list. But I don't think this is really targeted towards photo creators. It's more of a video camera, but that's just something to be aware of. So even though the ZV-1F is the cheapest Sony camera you can buy new, it's not the only point and shoot you can buy new, and there are some drawbacks to the 1F. But we can also look at the original ZV-1 and the ZV-1 Mark II, which is what I'm recording on right now. All of these cameras look very similar, but there are some significant differences between each of the variations of the ZV-1 series. The original ZV-1 has a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, and then the ZV-1 Mark II has an 18 to 50 millimeter lens. And the primary complaint about the original ZV-1 is that that 24 millimeters wasn't wide enough for vloggers or even people using their camera as a webcam. So when Sony put out the ZV-1F, they widened that field of view to 20 millimeters, and then the ZV-1 Mark II, which is what I'm recording on now, they widened it even further to an 18 millimeter widest focal length. And that's how I'm getting this wide field of view, even though I'm pretty close to the camera right now. At the time of recording this video, the original ZV-1 is $748 and the ZV-1 Mark II is $898. So almost $900 for a point and shoot camera is getting pretty up there as far as price is concerned. Since the ZV-1F was the most budget variation of this series, both of these cameras feature a few upgrades, including phase detect autofocus instead of the contrast detect autofocus on the 1F variant. And this also comes with the benefit of not getting those weird micro jitters or focus breathing when you're recording video. None of that's happening right now. I'm in continuous focus on the ZV-1 Mark II, and the same thing is true for the ZV-1 Mark I. We don't get any of those weird jittery effects when you're in autofocus. Both of these cameras also have a built-in ND filter, and all that is really is basically putting almost like sunglasses in front of your camera to be able to cut out light from hitting the sensor so you can shoot at proper shutter speeds for video. It's kind of a technical thing, but it is really helpful when you're shooting outdoors in really bright environments. Both of these cameras can also shoot RAW photos, unlike the ZV-1F, which is great for photographers. Now, if you're deciding between the Mark I and the Mark II, you'd want to think about these three things in particular. The Mark I is on the older menu system that's just a little bit older and it's not as user-friendly in my opinion. And the ZV-1 Mark II has the more updated menu that's more in line with all of Sony's newest cameras that they've just released. The Mark I also only has touchscreen capabilities when you want to focus. So you can tap the back of the screen to focus on a certain area. But then the Mark II has full touch operation controls over basically every aspect of the camera, from navigating the menu to changing different settings to even hitting record or zooming using the screen rather than physical buttons on the camera. So just way better touch operation here. The original ZV-1 also doesn't have a USB-C port, and the ZV-1 Mark II does have that USB-C port, which is really helpful, especially because you can live stream directly from that USB-C port and you don't have to use an HDMI capture card. There are some other minor differences and intricacies to each of these cameras, but these are the main differences between all of them, and I wanted to highlight all three for you so you can kind of just know what the top of the line ZV-1 Mark II $900 would get you, and then all the way down to the ZV-1F at $500. There's a pretty wide disparity there in price points, so you just have to decide for yourself what is most important to you and then make your purchase accordingly. Okay, now getting away from some of those point and shoot options, we're going to look at some more detachable lens cameras that are APS-C sensor size, starting with the original Sony ZV-E10. At the time of recording this video, this camera costs $698 new, but again, this camera also tends to go on sale for around $600. This camera was released back in 2021, but even as recent as 2023, this was Sony's best-selling camera across all cameras that they provide, which really just says a lot about how this camera has been received by consumers. People love the ZV-E10. I personally can't say enough good things about this camera. We've actually covered this camera a ton on Think Media, and if you have any questions about this camera, we probably have already produced a dedicated video answering that question for you because we love this thing. As far as video specs, we get really good 4K video at 24 and 30 frames per second, as well as 1080p up to 120 FPS for really slow motion footage. I'm typically using this camera in 4K for YouTube videos or even just getting casual B-roll around the studio. And honestly, the 4K footage holds up really nicely, even as I compare it to some of my higher end cameras. This camera actually has the same sensor as the Sony a6100, a6400, and a6600, that same series of a6000 cameras. And all of these cameras are known for getting great video results, so this camera doesn't disappoint either. It is only 8-bit color, so if you're someone who likes to shoot in some of the log or flat profiles of this camera, it won't do as good of a job as retaining as much color information as some of the cameras that we will talk about in just a minute. This camera's autofocus is outstanding, really great eye tracking autofocus, so wherever I move, left, right, forward, back, it's going to track my eye no problem. When it comes to taking photos with this camera doesn't have a viewfinder, but it does still take really good photos because it is sporting that great sensor. Everybody would say that the a6400 or a6600 is a great camera, and rightfully so because they are. Well, this camera is sporting that same sensor, so you're going to get the same photo results. The ZV-E10 is a pretty good vlogging camera, as even this whole line of ZV cameras are targeted towards the content creator or vlogger crowd. But the only drawback of this camera is that, again, it has no IBIS, so no in-body image stabilization. So it does get pretty shaky if you're trying to move the camera around a bunch and walk around with the camera unstabilized. You do have the ability to turn on active steady shot, but it's going to add a huge crop to your image, which isn't super practical if you're trying to vlog and maintain a wide field of view. So it can be a good vlogging camera, you just sort of need to know its limitations. You also get a USB-C webcam feature, which is pretty cool, but it's only limited to 720p video. I don't know why Sony has done this with several different cameras, so I personally would go the route of using an HDMI capture card with this camera instead of only being limited to 720p by using the USB-C streaming feature. And if you do go the route of streaming through the HDMI port, this camera is going to stream for hours on end and really not struggle with overheating in 1080p. So even though there are a few limitations with the ZV-E10, I think the image quality is beautiful. It has a really good amount of features, and honestly, this is one of the best cameras for anyone to pick up if you're just starting out. I've linked this camera down below in the description so you can find the best deal if you're interested. Now, the next camera we'd recommend is the updated version of the ZV-E10, which is the ZV-E10 Mark II. This is priced at $998, so just under $1,000, and with that increased price point, you are getting some significant improvements over the previous model. The biggest improvement by far is the brand new sensor. The ZV-E10 was using the older a6000 series sensor from the mid-2010s, and this updated 26 megapixel sensor is way better at shooting in low light conditions especially, and also retaining better color information. This camera can record in 10-bit color, which is going to be really helpful, especially if you want to experiment shooting in some of the log profiles, which are kind of the flat color profiles of this camera. So this will be great for color correcting and getting the best image possible out of this camera. This camera also gets the Z100 battery, which is going to improve your battery life a ton. This is just a larger battery, and it's kind of the standard battery in these newer and more premium Sony Alpha cameras. So it's great that the ZV-E10 Mark II gains this larger battery. You also get this really cool dedicated vertical information display when you shoot in vertical orientation with the camera. So it's really great for creating vertical content for social media or even taking vertical photos. It's just really convenient not to have to look at your settings sideways when you're trying to create vertical content. So this is the first Sony camera to have this vertical information display, and I absolutely love it. The original ZV-E10 had a really limited touch screen where you kind of could just tap a button to focus, but this upgraded model has a fully integrated touch touchscreen where you can use to navigate menus and change settings and do basically everything via the touch menu. With the USB-C streaming feature, you do get 4K up to 30 frames per second, which is way improved from the 720p USB-C streaming feature of the Mark I. I will say it does tend to overheat with USB streaming when you do shoot in that 4K resolution, especially when you don't use one of these cool fans from Ulanzi. This fan helps cool the camera down and just get rid of a ton of heat to extend the run times when you're shooting in 4K. But if you don't use one of these fans, the USB-C streaming feature is definitely going to overheat. And in general, this camera tends to just overheat for longer record times in basically every 4K mode. You're usually safe for around 2 to 2.5 hours in 4K at 20 FPS, but the 4K 60 in this camera is limited to like 20 minutes before it overheats. And we still also don't get in-body image stabilization, which is tricky if you're wanting to use this camera as a vlog camera. It's still going to be pretty shaky and not that smooth when you're actively walking with the camera. And you still don't get a viewfinder with the ZV-E10 Mark II, even though this does take pretty good photos. And I had a great time taking pictures with this camera. I think the photos turned out beautifully that I took when I was vacationing with my family in California. And overall, the ZV-E10 Mark II is a pretty solid hybrid camera for both photo and video creators for under $1,000. Now this brings us to the Sony a6700. And at the time of recording this video, this costs about $1,400 new for the body only. And this has the same sensor as the ZV-E10 Mark II. So you get all those benefits of that updated sensor, including 10-bit color to get really good color out of the camera, better noise performance, and overall just way better image quality. Now, because this is $400 more, they did add a few other features, including when you do shoot in 4K at 60 frames per second, it doesn't overheat as often because this camera just has better thermal performance. And this is the most affordable Sony camera to be able to shoot in 4K at 120 frames per second, but it does add a 1.5 times crop to your image when you do shoot in this. And this is on top of the already existing 1.5 times crop that APS-C sensors have. So man, we're doing math out here. So if you're shooting on a 20mm lens like this right here, the 1.5 times crop factor that already exists with APS-C cameras would make this a 30mm lens. And then I think you would times 1.5 again. So that would be an additional 15mm, making this 20mm lens act more like the field of view of a 45mm lens. So that's a pretty massive crop when you shoot in 4K at 120 FPS. But at least they gave it to us. And with that increase in price, we also finally get IBIS with this camera. So this camera does have in-body image stabilization, which means there's kind of like a gimbal inside of the camera that keeps the sensor stable when you're moving the camera around too much. This is really helpful for getting smoother motion when you're shooting video, or even when you're shooting photos at a slower shutter speed. That IBIS is going to help reduce motion blur. And speaking of photos, this camera does have an EVF, which is an electronic viewfinder, and photographers are going to love this. So if you're a hybrid shooter and you do both photo and video work, a lot of photographers love to have that viewfinder to look through when they're taking photos. You also get the same 26 megapixel stills as the ZV-E10 Mark II, but in my opinion, this just feels like a better photo camera. And in terms of hybrid cameras that Sony offers, this is, in my opinion, the best photo and video option hybrid that Sony currently offers for their APS-C lineup. And the final camera on our list is the Sony FX30. So this camera costs $1,798, so almost $1,800. But this is an amazing entry-level cinema camera. This actually has the same sensor as the ZV-E10 Mark II and a6700. So these three cameras all will create the same image quality for video especially. But the FX30 is improved in a few ways for video shooters. First, there's a bigger body design with 1/4-inch threads all across the body. This is also the only camera on our list that features 2 SD card slots. So if you're somebody who loves to have an overflow card slot or a built-in backup while you're shooting, this is the only option to provide you that second card slot. You also get a full-size HDMI slot, so no more of this micro HDMI that aren't as reliable. You also get a built-in fan on the body, which is just going to help with heat generation and allow you to record much longer for 4K 60 and 120 frames per second. And there's also a few other improvements that this camera has, but what it does not have is it doesn't have a viewfinder. So if you would like having a viewfinder to take photos, it does not have this. It also doesn't have a mechanical shutter. So you can still take still images, but you will see some banding at times if you're shooting indoors with different sorts of lights that won't interact very well with this electronic shutter. So it's really, in general, not a very good photo camera, even though it can take pictures. The main things that I would use this for is, first, long form YouTube videos. It's actually my main studio camera that I use all the time. I just always have my FX30 set up in my studio, ready to record YouTube videos at a moment's notice because I know it's never going to overheat and it's just going to run for as long as I want it to record. But also, if you're still a beginner, but you want to start a long form video podcast, this might be the best option right off the bat because all of these other cameras, if you're going to record to SD cards and have just a standard battery inside for over 2 or 3 hours, this is going to be your best option by far because you're going to have no problems with overheating. And also, if you are somebody who shoots a lot outdoors, like you want to get into wedding filmmaking, or if you want to shoot corporate marketing promos and you're outside in direct sunlight, this will be the best option by far. Granted, this camera is pretty overkill for a lot of people, but it is something you can grow into if you know that you want to, down the road, get into some more professional video work. This camera will easily be relevant for the next 7 to 8 years. So if I was just starting out and I literally had nothing, like no camera, no lens, no knowledge of video or photography, I personally would recommend that you pick up the original ZV-E10. You can literally ask any of my friends or people who reach out to me on Instagram DMs. This is almost always the camera that I point someone to. It's a great balance of affordability, image quality, and features. The ability to change lenses also is really helpful if you decide you want to continue to pursue photography or video work in the future. You want to have that flexibility to change lenses and upgrade lenses over time. Also, the 4K resolution that this camera has makes this camera relevant for many, many years as the world continues to move more and more towards 4K. And overall, it's just a really good camera. So if you do decide to purchase one of these cameras, you'll want to check out this video right here that highlights the best budget lenses for Sony alpha cameras. So you can click or tap the screen right here to watch that video, and I'll see you in the next one.